Greetings to everyone joining us tonight for our third event of the year as the Virginia Worker. This is just one among many events to come, and we hope you will continue to join us as we host guest speakers presenting on a range of topics covering the history of the Virginia working class and other relevant topics for Virginia workers. Our goal as the Virginia Worker is to build a distinctly pro-worker and independent ideological pole of attraction for the Virginia working class, which otherwise does not exist. We are comprised of groups across the state who emphasize organizing workers independently from capitalist parties and their auxiliary organizations, which is to the detriment of Virginia workers. Our website is meant to popularize the struggles, campaigns, reports, and debate across the state affecting Virginia workers. We welcome all contributions from Virginia workers that fall in line with our mission statement, which you can find at thevirginiaworker.com. And so now I'm going to lead into Brent's intro here. Brent Tarter is a retired research historian and senior editor at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. He is the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of 16 volumes on various aspects of Virginia history, including in 2019, Gerrymanders, How Redistricting Has Protected Slavery, White Supremacy, and Partisan Minorities in Virginia. The most recent are his General History of the State, Virginians and Their Histories, and with Marianne E, Julienne and Barbara C, Batson, The Campaign for Woman Suffrage in Virginia, both published in 2020. His 2013 volume, The Grandees of Government, The Origins and Persistence of Undemocratic Politics in Virginia, traces how, from the formation of the first institutions of government and the use of slavery in the 17th century through the American Revolution, the Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, and into the 21st century, Virginia's history has been marked by obstacles to democratic change. I'll pass it over to you, Brent, and let you present on your book tonight.
Well, first off, thank you for the invitation to take part. I've been studying Virginia history now for many decades, and it's one of my favorite things to talk with people about. I always learn when I have conversations with people, and I hope that occasionally they'll learn a little something from me. This book, The Grandees of Government, The Origins and Persistence of Undemocratic Politics in Virginia, is a result of 40 years of my studying and reading about Virginia's history. I've been very fortunate in my career that I was at a place where I could get into the original manuscript and print records of every decade of Virginia's history since the English invasion of 1607. That has given me an opportunity to see in detail a great many portions of Virginia history that most people don't know much about. And as I was doing that, I would notice oddities, or I would notice interesting episodes, or I would see emerging patterns begin to take place in my mind. After 40 years of researching and writing like that, I saw some patterns that led to the writing of this book. The subtitle, The Origins and Persistence of Undemocratic Politics in Virginia, tells you what the book is about. The title, The Grandees of Government, tells you who done it. The phrase, the Grandees of Government, comes from the 1750s. At that time, Great Britain and France were fighting a war. The North American portion of that war we call the French and Indian War. The French were allied with a number of the Western nations and in Western Canada, as well as the Ohio Valley, in fighting against the spread of English colonies into what we now call the Midwest. During that war, the government of colonial Virginia raised 2 regiments of soldiers and stationed them out on the frontier to protect the settlers from the French and the Indians who were fighting just beyond the frontier. One of those regiments was at Winchester, which at that time was almost on the northwestern frontier. The commanding officer of that regiment was young Colonel George Washington. Washington sent an agent down to Williamsburg, the capital, to collect the regimental payroll and money with which to purchase necessary supplies. But when the agent got to Williamsburg, he couldn't do that. And the reason was that the royal governor and the members of the General Assembly had been engaged in a series of protracted rows with each other. And the legislators did not trust the royal governor. So when they appropriated money to support these regiments, they created a joint committee of legislators to control the dispersal of the money. Well, now, these were members of the House of Burgesses and member of the Royal Governor's Council. They were all tobacco planters and merchants, and they lived all over Eastern Virginia. And when Washington's agent got to Williamsburg, there was not a quorum of the committee to do business. These people were all off tending to their own private business and not being able to fund the regiment. So Washington's agent wrote a letter to George Washington explaining all of this and said, we have no choice. We have to await the conveniency of the grandees of government. When I read that letter about 30 years ago, I thought, my golly, that's a wonderful phrase that explains how the colonial government worked. It was the tobacco planters and slave drivers, the big shots, who ran the colonial government basically in their own class interest. Well, one of the patterns that I saw was that you could see replications of that throughout nearly all of Virginia's history. In fact, I concluded that it's not incorrect to say that until the middle of the 19th century, the government of Virginia was government of the tobacco planters, by the tobacco planters, and for the tobacco planters. As industrialization came in 1850s, 60s, and thereafter, and railroads linked places together, and you get the big national corporations changing the nature of the American economy, the tobacco planters lost out on their influence, but big business gained in its influence. So Virginia government ceased to be pretty much a government of, by, and for the tobacco planters, and it became a government of, by, and for the businessmen. Railroad company executives, bankers, lawyers, industrialists of various sorts, people engaged in very large-scale finance capitalism, exercised the same kind of influence in directing public policies in Virginia that the tobacco planters and slave drivers had done before the Civil War. So the title appealed to me, and it helped me see more clearly how I could explain what had always puzzled me. Why did the government of Virginia always seem to be resistant to change? You know, even at the time of the American Revolution, when the Virginia leadership committed an act of collective treason by kicking the king out of the government, still they didn't change hardly anything else. They used the opportunity to make certain that their influence over their plantations and their slave property and their access to markets and their control of credit stayed just the same. In part, the American Revolution occurred in Virginia in order that those people could protect themselves, both from the Parliament of Great Britain and the King, but also from challenges within that might weaken their dominance. They used their powers in controlling the laws, writing the laws, sitting on the courts, and enforcing the laws in order to maintain their positions. Now, you have to remember that until the 1860s, virtually everybody of public consequence in Virginia was a slave driver. They engaged in importing slaves, buying and selling them, managing them. In the 19th century, the biggest cash business in the state was selling enslaved people to the Mississippi Valley. They made more money doing that than they did raising tobacco or building railroads, any other agricultural commodity. Surplus slaves were their biggest cash crop. They used their laws to make sure that they preserved their capacity to manage slavery in their interest. You know, you have to remember, slavery is a labor management tool. They created new laws in order to protect slavery, to advance the interests of slave owners, and to protect themselves. Well, after the end of slavery, the big businesses in Virginia did something similar, especially in the 20th century. I mean, Virginia has been notoriously unfriendly to labor organizations. I can remember when I moved to Virginia, and actually up until fairly recent times, nearly every time you drove down the highway and crossed the county boundary, there was a little sign there that, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was, you know, a business-friendly community. Well, I wondered what that meant. It turns out it meant that somebody had decided that the infrastructure of roads and sewers and electric lines and stuff was sufficient to support the establishment of new businesses. But by listening to the politicians, I thought what that probably means is that if you owned a business and some labor organizers showed up on your property, you could get the sheriff to come out and beat the hell out of them. That's the way that the government of Virginia seems to have worked more often than not. I mean, that's a crude overstatement, so please don't quote me on that. But that's the way that it looked. If you read tax laws, that's not much fun, but if you read tax laws, you will see that the laws were written to benefit prosperous people at the expense of everybody else. If you look at appropriations for schools or for public health, or for almost anything that is beneficial to working class people and especially to poor people, you will see that the state and local governments of Virginia have generally been quite stingy. Taxes, those were the ugliest words in Virginia public discourse for decades. They may still be. Just read the newspaper or listen to the news or find some other podcast. People are afraid of taxes. Nobody likes to pay taxes. I understand that. I don't either. But you should pay for what you need. We do that when we buy an automobile. We do that when we buy groceries. We do that when we go to the doctor and have to pay the bill. It's a cost of living well. It's a cost of civilization. But Virginians as taxpayers and Virginia political leaders have always been very reluctant to do that. They claim Virginia is a high tax state, but it really isn't in comparison to many other states. But anyway, this is part of one of those patterns that you see. If you look across the long run of Virginia's history, you will see that the state government has nearly always been slanted in favor of the interests of the dominant business class and against the interests of working people. We've never had a very robust union presence in Virginia, and right now it's at the lowest it's been since the 19th century. Clever lawyers and businesses have used the existing law in order to make boycotts and strikes much more difficult. And as the economy changes, unions have not yet caught on in very many of the new enterprises. I mean, just look at what the Amazon and Starbucks people now are trying to unionize, and they're facing all manner of opposition. Just like in the 1920s and 30s when unions had a difficult time getting going. But up until after World War II, unions were much stronger all over the country than they are now. Well, what about non-union labor? I mean, that's most of us. Where is your leverage? You're outvoted and outspent, which means that the interests of working class people and poor people are thinly represented in the General Assembly. None of this works in a democratic way. One of the things we need to remember is democracy is a process, it's not an outcome. The process must be open, it must be above board, it must give everybody an opportunity to take part. Everybody can't take part equally, but there shouldn't be barriers to people taking part. Another dull thing you can do is read voting laws. They tell you a lot. Nearly all of the voting laws in Virginia, since the first ones in the 1640s, tell you who cannot vote. They don't positively guarantee that you have a right to vote. Now, the state constitutions beginning in 1869 seem to say that, but enforcing it and the laws are another matter. They made it so difficult to register and vote that very few people could. In the colonial period, the only people they allowed to vote were adult white men who owned a certain minimum amount of real estate. That was the case up to 1851. In 1851, they finally allowed adult white men who didn't own property to vote. After the Civil War, they reluctantly allowed adult Black men to vote. It's not until 1920 that women in Virginia got the right to vote. But the laws were so restrictive that not very many people did. One of the most famous events in Virginia's history is the Constitutional Convention that met in 1901 and 1902 with the stated purpose. This is not a secret. This was, they talked about this all the time. The stated purpose was to deny the vote to as many Black men as possible and to keep them out of public life. They did this by requiring payment of a poll tax every year before you could go and register. You had to pay the poll tax 6 months before the registration date. You had to keep the receipt for the poll tax. Poll tax was strange. The Constitution prohibited state agents from trying to collect the tax. It was a voluntary tax. You had to go pay it on your own. You had to find the tax collector and pay the tax and be sure you got the receipt and keep the receipt. And then 6 months later, you would go try to find the voter registrar and show the tax poll tax receipt and then try to register to vote. And to register to vote, you had to provide in writing without assistance a whole long list of vital statistics, saying how old you were, where you worked, where you lived the last 3 years, and a whole bunch of stuff like that that a lot of people probably didn't even know. They could hand you a blank piece of paper and expect you to know all this and write it out unaided. That's what they did with Republicans and Black men at the time. They would give a form to respectable white men who they thought would probably vote Democratic. They put all of these obstacles in the way of voting to such an extent that in a very important and classic book published in 1949, the political scientist V.O. Key calculated that a smaller proportion of adult Virginians voted than in any other state in the country or in any other country in the world that pretended to have a representative democracy. Now, Virginians had always been inhospitable as a government to the idea of democracy. What the grandees will claim is that they have a representative government. Well, yeah, they do. They're elected. But by restricting the electorate, you have a government that represents only just some people, the tobacco planters or the industrialists or the bankers or the rich people. And so it is not a democratic government, and you cannot expect such a restricted electorate to force the government to do more. One thing that struck me when I first started studying Virginia history was that under the domination of the early 20th century grandees of government, Virginia sent fewer supporters of the New Deal to Congress than any other state. Every other Southern state had advocates of economic reform and change in the Senate and the House of Representatives. I mean, they were all segregations and racists, but that was to be expected at the time. But they were not all opposed to economic change on behalf of the people that they depended on to re-elect them. Well, the Virginia politicians didn't depend on working class and poor people because they couldn't vote. They were voiceless. They were powerless. This is how an undemocratic system works to the disadvantage of a majority of people. If you go to your library someday and look at some old newspapers, say from the time of the Constitutional Convention of 1901 and 2, or from the 1930s, when there was a great deal of economic reform in the air and the government was assuming large new roles in the regulation of relationships between people and big businesses, you can read those newspapers and see what people were saying about the restricted electorate. And then go read tomorrow morning's newspaper and see what people are saying about efforts to restrict electorates in many of the states now. They don't talk about kicking Black people out. They don't talk about kicking Hispanics out. They talk about guaranteeing against election fraud, but there is almost none. I mean, voting is now more honest in Virginia than it has ever been. What they're really talking about doing is reducing the number of the people who are likely to vote for liberal Democrats. This is very partisan. This is very much an incumbent protection device that Republicans have adopted. But we must not let the Democrats off the hook, because all of those restrictive laws that made it extremely difficult for people to vote before World War II were laws that Democrats passed. Democrats have gerrymandered electoral districts throughout the 20th century to their advantage, in the same way that Republicans gerrymandered electoral districts in the early decades of the 21st century to do the same thing, to get it to their advantage. So, they dream up an excuse to achieve a political objective. It's either segregationist, or save slavery, or keep the liberals out, or to stop government from regulating big business. That's what I mean by the influence of the grandees of government, from their tax policies to their election laws, to their practices, to their appropriations. They have slanted it in their interest. This should not be a surprise. This happens nearly anywhere. People with clout exercise it, prefer to keep it. But I've tried to connect this throughout the whole of Virginia's history. So you can't just blame one group of people for the problems of that year or that decade. It all fits into a much, much larger pattern. That pattern is what caused me to write this book. Now, I regret that it had to be such a long book. It is a very long book. It's complicated and full of different kinds of material that I used to try to make the point. I originally thought I would write a short book, but then I realized many people know about one portion of Virginia's history, but not much about other portions. Maybe they're interested in the Revolutionary War. Maybe they're interested in the Civil Rights Movement. Maybe they're interested in the Woman Suffrage movement. But they may know a lot less about other aspects. And if I needed to be very thorough on each portion of Virginia's history that I wrote about, so that people who knew about that portion would say, okay, maybe he knows what he's writing about, and be more willing to accept what I wrote about time periods that they know less about. That's why it turned out to be a large book full of information. In my research over many years, I have come across scads of wonderful stories, interesting people, loathsome behavior that seemed to me to enable me to try to present a connected narrative about how little may have changed throughout Virginia's history. I mean, we historians study change over time, but change takes place in Virginia within continuity. Change and continuity both have to be looked at, and the continuities are extremely strong. I mean, my working title for the book actually was not The Grandees of Government. It was going to be Semper Idem. Semper Idem. That was the motto of the first Queen Elizabeth. It means always the same. But it's not always the same. There have been people from the very beginning, as there are today, who have tried to change Virginia and to make it a more democratic society, make its politics operate more democratically, change the direction of its economic progress. And if you write only about the people who resisted change, you leave out the most interesting people in Virginia's history, who are the ones who were promoting change. You leave out all the Black people. You leave out all the women people. You leave out the Indian people. You leave out poor white trash like me. And so you wind up writing about the same people that have been praising one another in the history books for 350 years. You're writing about old, prosperous white men. That's 3 or 4 minorities there all at once. So anyway, what I tried to do was to lay this out in enough detail and over a long enough period of time that the patterns that I perceived could be understood. Now, I'm a historian. I look at the past. I don't try to predict the future. I'm not a soothsayer. But I do know that the continuity is built deeply into the system. And it's very difficult to change, very difficult to change. We don't see political parties changing control of the state government very often. I mean, the Democrats dominated the General Assembly from the 1880s almost to the end of the 1990s, and the Republicans were in for about 20 years. Now it's split. We had decades and decades of Democratic governors, and then we had several decades with a lot of Republican governors, and now it's going back and forth. Partisan alignments in Virginia have changed radically over the years too. Up until, we'll say, World War II, the Democratic Party was much more conservative in Virginia than the Republican Party. There wasn't any room to the right of Harry Byrd's Democrats in the first half of the 20th century. And the Republicans were old, economic reforming Republicans like Theodore Roosevelt, who had democratic impulses. They were strong in southwestern Virginia and actually throughout the entire mountain regions of Virginia. But then that changed. By the 1970s, the Democrats and the Republicans had swapped places, where the Democrats became more democratic and more inclusive, and the Republicans, just like the National Republican Party, became more and more conservative. So you can't just assume that things have always been the same. The continuities are there in terms of the ideas that have been dominant, even though the reformers, who were once the Republicans, were then the Democrats. It's the cast of characters and the times that change, not the ideas. I mean, I don't want to talk for a long time. This is basically why I wrote this book and what I hope to persuade people that we can see if we look at Virginia's history and comprehend the experiences of everybody, not just the grandees, not just the prosperous old white men who, for the most part, have been the ones who have run Virginia. So I would like to pause here and hear from the audience. If you have a question, you have an objection, you have a criticism, let's start a conversation. I think that's much more interesting than just listening to me gas on for a long time.
Yeah, great. So the way we do this is we have folks type their question into the chat. I'll read the question off to you, and then you can respond. So for everyone who has a question, please type it out into the chat. I'll read it off. Do it on a first come, first served basis here.
Don't be bashful.
I mean, one question I did, have was, you talk about the broader pattern here of anti-democratic tendencies. Like, what would you call that pattern? Why does it exist?
Oh, well, that's actually a good question. It's deeply rooted in self-interest. It's deeply rooted in class interest. One of the things that I think we mislearned when we're young, in our civics classes in middle school or high school, is that we have a classless society. Well, I mean, that's a good objective. It's a laudable objective, but it's at war with fact. We have always had, working class people. We've had prosperous people. We've had enslaved people. We have unemployed people. And it's no accident, I think, that the privileged class tends to dominate the public debate, tends to dominate the public office holding. They're the ones that write the laws. They're the ones that can go to law school and become judges. And they have a larger influence than just, ordinary people who spend their whole lifetimes trying to get along. And so that self-interest militates against their willingness to change, however much, opponents of slavery fought against them, or however much advocates of universal white manhood suffrage fought against them, or however much civil rights activists fought against them, or advocates of woman suffrage. It's not an even playing field. The political deck of cards is marked.
Thanks. We have a question from Keith. He was wondering, are there actual continuities among the elites, members of the first families of Virginia who were tobacco planters becoming industrialists, for example?
Oh yes, there definitely are. These one of the things that interests me, I've never done the research, but I think that if you go back and you read through lists of members of the General Assembly, say in 1840 and 50, the leadership, you'll find most of the major big plantation owning families represented. If you look, say, in the 1880s, the people who are in charge of the banks and the railroads and the law schools, it's the same families. They made a transition from being mostly an agricultural tobacco planting society into being the beginnings of a modern industrial finance capitalism. And it's, the people grew up on a big plantation and went to law school and became a railroad president. That's really very easy to see if you just are familiar with the names of the families, because business and industry replaced tobacco planting in the middle of the 19th century as the most lucrative and influential thing anybody could do. Does that answer the question well enough? I can make up something else. I see Keith gave me a thumbs up, so I guess that was okay.
We have a next question here from Mike that kind of builds off of that one pretty well. Mike says, your book does an excellent job demonstrating how classes like planters or industrialists have ruled over working and enslaved people, in part through restriction of the franchise. Can you expand on how the rich still rule Virginia today at the expense of working Virginians and how we might challenge that?
Well, let me give one example. We could probably adduce a good many examples. But if you look at the campaign finance laws of Virginia, which members of the General Assembly write, they're amongst the loosest in the country. If you're running for the General Assembly or you're running for re-election to the General Assembly, you can collect campaign tax money and then spend it on a trip to Disneyland. You spend it on your own personal self, even though the people who donated that money wanted you to use it to get elected, so that a candidate who got elected would pursue the public policy wishes of that voter or that campaign donor. But those laws are very loose. The disclosure of who donates how much to whom are very, very loose. And some people have a lot more resources than others. This is a good, for instance, I think this will maybe tie things together a little bit. I remember very well back in 1977 when Republican Lieutenant Governor John Dalton was the candidate for governor, and he ran against former Democratic Lieutenant Governor Henry Howell. Well, Henry Howell was a foremost champion of the working classes of the time. And the Dalton campaign made a big deal out of Henry Howell receiving campaign contributions from Virginia's rather weak labor unions. They said he would be a tool of national labor leaders and therefore bad for Virginia. Well, I actually went and I looked at the campaign finance data from the own file in the archives of the Library of Virginia in Richmond. You can go look at it too. Dull as all get out, but really interesting. Howell did receive a good deal of money from labor unions. Dalton didn't receive a single penny from working people. Dalton received vast deals of money from business interests, but nobody accused Dalton of becoming a Virginia tool of the National Association of Manufacturers or the National Chamber of Commerce. And in fact, Henry Howell received a lot more money from businesses than he did from laboring people. But nobody paid attention to that. We're accustomed to think, because of the nature of the public discourse in this state, that organized labor is bad. It almost resembles an insurrection of slaves. But that organized businessmen are good. Businessmen provide the jobs. Working people ought to be glad to get them. That's almost a slave driver's view. This is the way public discourse works. And it enables the people with the most money to make the most influential campaign contributions, buy the most television ads. In the olden days, they put up bulletin boards and handed out bumper stickers, put people in the in the lines at the election booths in order to persuade people how to vote or to intimidate them to vote the other way. So this is just a fairly open way in which money shouts. Another question?
We have one from Mary. She was wondering what was the name of the author who wrote the book about how diverse it was in like Southwestern and West Virginia you were mentioning before we started the formal talk. I don't know if you recall.
Oh yeah, I think you're referring to a book entitled Coal Towns, C-O-A-L, Coal Towns by Crandall Shiflett, who taught for many, many years at Virginia Tech. It's a really fine book on company towns in the coal industry in Appalachia, not just in Virginia. It's got evidence from Tennessee and a lot of good material in there from Kentucky and West Virginia, as well as Southwestern Virginia, which is a region, and that's a place where state boundaries may make much less difference. But that's a terrific book about working people before and after the unions came in, because at one time, the coal industry was pretty well unionized throughout much of Appalachia from the 1930s to the 1950s. There have been a lot of attempts to make it more difficult for unions to operate, and the Eastern mining interests have suffered greatly by cheaper coal coming out of the Rocky Mountains and other places. And the Virginia coal just can't compete. And so people have lost jobs because of changing national economic patterns. And that happens throughout nearly all industries. I mean, my goodness, there used to be a huge and thriving, profitable furniture manufacturing interest in the area around Martinsville. And that's almost completely dead now as a result of national and international economic changes over which the people who worked there had no control. People who worked in the textile mills in Danville had no control. Even if they've unionized, they couldn't keep the company from being bought out by somebody else who then would move production overseas. So there are many things that that working people have little or no influence over, even though those things affect their lives, our lives, very, very profoundly. And without much political clout or without a strong union, you don't even have a very good chance to influence the things that you should be in a position to influence.
Gabe wants to first say thank you for your time. And he asks, before she comments, there appears to have been a split in the state between Northern Virginia and the rest of Virginia. Who would you say makes up today's ruling class in Virginia?
Oh, that's another good question. Virginia has always had a lot of regional diversity. The mountains and valleys are different than the Tidewater. In fact, Southwestern Virginia is different from the Shenandoah Valley. Before the Civil War, when Virginia was much larger and included what is now West Virginia, you could see that there were separate interests out there farther west in the Ohio Valley. I mean, Virginia before the Civil War was an Ohio Valley state, as well as a southern state, and as well as an mid-Atlantic state. But regional diversity has always been very, very pronounced in Virginia. Some of it's rooted in geography, some of it's rooted in historical evolution, some of it's rooted in demographic change. I have a very good friend who taught for many years at Old Dominion University in Norfolk. And Norfolk and Richmond are very, very different places. He said that when he drove up from Norfolk in the morning to do research in the archives in Richmond, he not only felt like he had driven 100 miles west, he had driven about 40 years back in time. There's just different cultures there. Northern Virginia is very different. I don't know whether you thought about this. One of my good friends pointed this out to me several years ago, that if you ask a Virginian where he or she lives, well, they'll answer. I live in Powhatan County. I live in Fredericksburg. I live in Big Stone Gap. With the exception of people who live in the northern part of the state, they don't say, I live in Vienna or I live in Manassas. They say, I live in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia has become a distinctly and easily recognized region with its own demographic characteristics, its own social characteristics, its own economic path, and as a consequence, its own political culture. It's very different in Northern Virginia than any place else. Virginia right now is most diverse culturally and economically and socially than it's ever been. And no place is more diverse than Northern Virginia, say from about maybe Winchester to Warrenton to Fredericksburg, and that corner of Virginia there is very unlike any place else. And it's also extraordinarily populous. So just by sheer numbers, that portion of Virginia is going to be the most influential one in statewide elections, and probably the most influential region in the election of members of the General Assembly. This regional diversity is really important to keep in mind in thinking about how the politics work, because that portion of Virginia, that northern Virginia, appears to be on a trajectory of continued growth, larger growth than in many other parts of Virginia. So although I try not to be a prophet and to try to tell the future, it looks to me as if that part of Virginia will continue to have a much larger influence than it should, or than it has. I probably shouldn't say should, than it has. I mean, it should have a large influence based on the number of people who live there. That would be the democratic way to do things. That's why redistricting of legislative and congressional seats is so extraordinarily important. It determines who gets to make the decisions.
Larry had a question. How much of a threat was immigration to maintaining power, I guess, over the course of Virginia history?
Only just twice. Immigration was critically important in the maintaining of power in the first 2 decades of Virginia settlement by the English. Now, we're talking here from the perspective of the Powhatan, not of the perspective of the English. The invasion of England, English people that began in 1607, was an alien invasion. A technologically superior culture claiming the right to control and occupy a landscape that people and their ancestors had lived there for thousands of years. That immigration seriously threatened and ultimately seriously damaged the culture and governance of the Powhatan people. As a general rule, immigration has not been a very large issue in Virginia culture or Virginia politics. It didn't take place in rapid bursts, as it say, if you think about the early part of the 20th century, when you get huge immigration from Italy and various parts of Eastern Europe into the northern cities, or the way that you saw, say, in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, large immigration from the German principalities into the same areas. And there was a lot of friction and a lot of resistance of those immigrants. That didn't happen so much in Virginia until the end of the 20th century. I wish I had the figures at my hand. I don't remember, but the number of people born outside the United States who lived in Virginia, according to the 2000 census, was very small, like just 2 or 3%. And now it's what, 15, 20%, and increasing. So as people move here from other countries, as people move here from other states with other kinds of cultural beliefs and traditions, Virginia is going to continue to change. And there are people who resent that change. In the olden days, those people would have expressed their language very much in terms of racial and cultural divisions. I don't think people do that so much anymore, at least openly. But if you are at risk of having to compete for your job with other people, you may feel threatened. If people who are different from you move into the neighborhood, you may feel uneasy. You shouldn't. It'd be difficult not to. But immigration is now a big potential issue. We don't have people, for the most part, threatening to throw people out of Virginia or threatening to restrict where they can come from in Virginia. But immigration is a big issue now, just simply because there are people coming here from all over the world, in Northern Virginia in particular. But you know, you can find this anywhere. I mean, when I moved to Virginia 50 years ago, you would see an occasional Chinese restaurant in a middle-sized town or a big one. You would see an occasional pizza joint or Italian restaurant. Now, every little town in the state has Chinese restaurants. They all have Mexican restaurants. Middle-sized and big-sized places have Filipino and Korean and Thai restaurants and Bolivian and Guatemalan. The amount of variety that you can see just by looking at public eating establishments and by what's available in the food sections of various kinds of ethnic markets indicates that we do have an immense variety now in a way that we never had before. And that's got to play out differently in the political culture. I mean, people who come to Virginia, say from the Midwest or from New England or from California, are going to come to Virginia and find a different political culture than they're accustomed to. It may be more conservative, it may be more welcoming, it is going to be different. But their presence here will change it also. So, you know, we must, as I said before, we must keep change and continuity in mind simultaneously.
Yeah, I had one question here. Did you see any prominent role that like third parties ever played over the course of like the political history of the state, like the Readjusters or anything like that, and being able to expand like democratic rights?
Third parties have not generally had a very good run in Virginia. The one you mentioned, the Readjuster Party, was a very short-lived biracial political coalition that formed at the end of the 1870s and dissolved by the middle of the 1880s. It was a unique and remarkable experiment in biracial politics. The Readjusters, they called themselves because they wanted to refinance the public debt, to readjust the public debt in order to reduce the amount of money that they were having to pay on interest and principal, chiefly so that they could divert that money to support the new public school system. We didn't have public education system in Virginia until 1870. And it immediately became very popular, not only among freed people who had had no opportunity for education at all, but also among poor white people who had little or no opportunity for public education. I think it's 44% of Virginians were illiterate in 1870. Public schools were very, very popular. But because the state had this old public debt left over from before the Civil War, the payment of interest on that debt threatened deficits every year for more than a decade. And what the General Assembly did, General Assembly was always dominated by conservative white men. They diverted money from the school budget into debt service. The Readjusters emerged in order to change that, to reduce the amount of money they had to pay for the debt and put that money in the hands of the schools. They did, they succeeded. They actually took control of the General Assembly in 2 consecutive elections, and they elected a governor in 1881. They did a remarkable job of reforming the state's economic and political culture. But as soon as they achieved that objective, many of the white people who had voted for the Readjusters subsided back into the old Democratic Party of white supremacy. So the biracial cooperation of this very brief Readjuster Party dissolved. And it's at that time in the 1880s when the modern Democratic Party evolved based on white supremacy, based on restricting the electorate. And it created a statewide conservative, democratic political machine that dominated the state for 80 years. It was the longest and most durable and probably the most powerful political machine in US history. And it originated in an attempt to destroy the biracial Readjuster Party so that working class people and farmers of both races could not again threaten the interests of the 19th century grandees. There is one other interesting little episode. This is in 1948 when President Harry Truman was running for re-election, and he endorsed a civil rights bill. Harry Truman had desegregated the armed forces. Harry Truman was a Democrat. Almost all the voters in Virginia were Democrats. The leadership was all opposed to Truman and what he was doing. And so were many other leading Southern white politicians. They broke away from the Democratic Party and nominated a third party candidate, South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, for president. They called themselves the Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats got enough votes in Virginia that they almost enabled the Republican presidential candidate to win the state. What's interesting, though, is that in a few eastern areas, such as around Norfolk and Portsmouth, Hampton, Newport News, there were enough Black voters who voted for Harry Truman that the Black voters helped the Democrats carry the state that year and defeat the segregationist candidate for president that year. That's a weak third party. It was more of a protest exhibition than anything else. But it's an instructive episode that it's possible, even when there weren't very many Black voters, for them to form the balance of power. Whether there will ever be other third parties that make any difference in Virginia, I don't know. It would be difficult. I mean, our whole political system is rigged now in favor of a two-party system. Somebody wins and somebody loses. If you have 4 or 5 parties, they're going to have a greater fear that somebody else is going to win. And so I don't think we're going to have influential third parties very often.
Yeah, when we had Dr. Peter Ratcliffe on here for our first event, he spoke about the history of the Knights of Labor in Richmond, and they actually made their own Working Men's Reform Party that took over the city council there, and were relatively effective in their brief period of existence. So it sounds like there was a lot of maybe regional variation or difference, which I believe Jared had a question sort of playing off that idea if there were regional differences in terms of democratic practices.
Right, and big differences between urban and rural portions of Virginia. We also need to remember that a majority of Virginians lived on farms or in small towns until the 1950s. So episodes that took place, like the forming of this working class coalition in Richmond, were in an abnormal place. And as you say, it was also very brief. Very difficult in those days to sustain cooperation between the races, just because white supremacy and racism were so prevalent throughout the entire culture, including working class people and rich people both. And white people outnumbered Black people. I mean, that makes a big difference at voting time too.
Mary asked if you've spoken about your book at Virginia Tech before. They had never heard about it, even though it addressed so many current issues. They said they're on the diversity committee, which is why they're asking.
No, I've not spoken there. I spoke in Christiansburg one time, which is just down the road, but not at Blacksburg. I'm afraid I'm not a very good salesman for my own books. I tend to treat them as intellectual exercises and less as merchandise.
Gabe says, while we have seen some progress in recent years, it seems the working class is actively being divided via identity politics. It's been astounding seeing how large corporations rally behind certain causes and push identity politics as progress while not delivering much, if any, palpable material gains to workers as a whole. Do you think this is something that could be overcome? You sounded pessimistic about the prospects of a third party, which is what I think we need to do. And given the history of the region, I can see why. What do you think the best path of action would be? Is there any hope in reforming either of the major parties, or what else can be done?
I don't know. I do think that what we're calling identity politics is very closely related to the old racial divide. It's not purely based on your skin color or whether you happen to have ancestry from Africa, but it's rooted in some of our diversity, cultural and ethnic diversity throughout the state. And, you know, nobody is just one thing. I'm an old person. I'm a white person. I'm a male person. I moved to Virginia 50 years ago, so I'm an immigrant person in that respect. We all have a mixture of identities that we share with some people and that we don't share with others. So people are, they use this self-identification as a tool to get votes. You know, sometimes it's to attract people and sometimes it's to scare people. That reminds me a lot of the tactics of white supremacists in the past. I don't want to accuse anybody of being a white supremacist right now because they may not be, but they may have other ideas that make them uneasy with different kinds of differences. I mean, you know, you look at objections that people have raised in the last 20 or 30 years to Muslims holding public office. I mean, that's a kind of identity politics. It might be perceived as a kind of a racism. It might be perceived as a religious prejudice, or maybe several of those. But we can all think of episodes that have taken place in our public life recently, particularly with the current and continuing discussions about gender roles and LGBTQ concerns, because that makes a lot of people very, very uneasy. And they feel threatened by that kind of change. And I think that's easy to understand, even though I don't sympathize with it. But I've lived through a lot of change like that, and I've come to see things very differently than I used to. I think that any change is going to take a long time, and it is going to win support from different people for different reasons. So just going out with one argument to everybody may not do the trick. We're not all going to live happily together ever after on the same terms, I'm afraid.
Well, I'll make one final call for any further questions here. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Well, these have been good questions. I'm very, very pleased at the quality of the questions. That means that at least some of you were paying attention and thinking about things as we went along. I taught school for a while before I became a professional historian, and I always decided class was a success if nobody snored and somebody asked a good question. Well, I don't know whether you snored, but you asked good questions, so I thank you for that.
Mary, thanks you as well. We've a lot of thanks in the chat as well. Thank you for your time and the presentation and answering these questions. I guess we'll go ahead and round it up here. Our next event is going to be on March 29th with author Doug Green presenting on his critical biography on Michael Harrington, the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America. So if anybody's interested, you can check that one out, and we'll be sure to share info on how you join that. And we'll post a recording of this up pretty soon. So thanks everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you.